Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel here. Now as you can see, I'm going in to revamp a little of this with my own care specifics. I do want to talk about how you water your Paphiopedilum today, but I think I'm brave enough to actually suggest exactly what I do. So I'm just going to give you a general background of why I water and, answer some general who, what, when, why, and where questions. And just to start off with Paphiopedilums being my favorite orchids here, these guys are primarily from Southeast Asia, from very tropical regions, and they grow in the humus layer of the earth. So they grow on the top layer of the earth, not necessarily in the ground, but on it. So they like a good amount of moisture, but they don't like to be wet and don't like to be dry. Now, with regard to that saying, I know it's a bit odd sometimes, but remember, we have our orchids potted in a well-draining media here, whether it's bark or a bit of moss. I don't suggest moss for paphs, and I'll get into that. But whether it's bark or anything that we're using to pot or paphs, primarily it's a draining mixture, which is why we want the pot to be moist. We don't want it to be wet with regard to sitting water, and we don't want it to be dry with regard to the absence of moisture altogether. So a good balance. I do pot mine in a mix of bark, perlite, and charcoal. In some of the pots, there is sphagnum. In some of my pots, a bit of sphagnum, but that's because I've been doing this for 2 years, and some of my plants are very, very specific with regard to their needs. But overall, I do have over 100, and basically everyone is under the same rule of thumb. Now, with regard to watering your paph, just like any type of plant, you want to water to keep that baby hydrated. So we don't want our plants looking wrinkly or withering away. So we want to water these orchids when the pot is approaching a dryness. Again, we want to keep the pot in even moist, and we don't want it to dry out. One way that I notice when I have to water my paph, and one way that I primarily live by, is the pot weight. Now, this is something that's going to come with experience, so visual cues such as the condensation on the clear pot, or physically putting your finger in the pot to see if there's moisture, maybe about an inch in, is going to be your best bet in the beginning until you know how that pot feels when it's dry, as opposed to when it's moist and wet just after watering. Because paphs, especially in the root area, they're not as forgiving as phals. They don't grow aerial roots. They're just reliant on the roots that are in that pot receiving that consistent moisture. Now, unlike phals and being forgiving, you may encounter your paph with wrinkly leaves due to dehydration. But in many cases, you're probably going to lose that leaf, especially the older leaves, once they're starting to get wrinkled, because they're a bit thinner. They're not as succulent, they're not as plump as the leaves of other orchids, so they're not able to store as much water, which is why they need this consistent moisture. With regard to your watering, my watering per se, I do separate the frequency in seasons. So I water more in the warmer seasons, and I slow down the watering in the cooler seasons. Now, I live here in Maryland, very close to DC in the States, and my warm seasons start about February to October. So my cues are Valentine's Day to Halloween, and then that cool down starts about Halloween to Valentine's Day, roughly, give or take. Now, with your Paphiopedilums, as a rule of thumb in general, they are slow growers, but you will see those signs of growth in their growth seasons. And like your phals, they will primarily grow when the temperatures raise and when the light duration starts to become longer. Here I do grow under LEDs, so all year round primarily my lighting is 12 hours, and then in the grow season I do start to slowly bump it up to about 14 and a half hours as it climaxes in July. With regard to the cooler season, I slow down that watering. So unlike the warm season where I'm watering about maybe twice a week, in the cooler seasons I get to slow down the watering till about once a week. Now again, with regard to your environment, that cool, dry down, or when your pot is going to be ready to water, is going to depend on how fast it dries in your environment. The humidity, the type of potting medium that you're using, is it a bit more water retentive or does it promote more drainage? Now, how and where you're watering these plants, like most orchids, you don't want to water the plant, just the medium, just the pot, which is why having that good drainage is so important. You want to make sure that pot stays moist all the time, but isn't wet and isn't dry. So basically just drench the pot. I do run water through the top of my pots as a rule of thumb when I water. My flushes, which is when I once a month just drain pure water through the pot, I do that as a bottom water. And I soak the bottom pot in a bucket with my hand for just a few seconds. I let it run through, and then I just put tap water, run it straight through to just refresh everything, because I don't want everything gone from the pot, but I do want any excess out of there. And with Paphiopedilums, there's a lot of talk about the type of water that you want to use. You can go ahead and research your water. I do recommend doing that, because with any plants, you probably don't want to use a water that's too hard. My water here is about 175 ppm, which for me isn't bad, because a consistent watering of the pot and the way I flush, I really don't have any type of challenges. But I have heard of some people having 300 and 500 ppm, and I'm not too sure if that's good for the path. So you might want to do a second water every time you water, which for me, I just couldn't. So thank God this water's fine. And I kind of want to leave you with a bit of what I do for fertilizing with my paths. Again, for the grow season, I fertilize about 2 times a month, and for the cool season, about once a month. And the dosages I'm using are 1/8 or 1/4, very small, because these guys don't enjoy a lot of fertilizer at all. They're slow growers and slow feeders. And the way I determine if I'm using 1/8 or 1/4, for me, is pot size. So if it's under 4 inches, I use 1/8 to fertilize. And if it's an over 4-inch pot, I use 1/4 to fertilize. I never go above 1/4, even if the plant is huge. Now, if it's a huge plant, many of our Paphiopedilums are small. But the multiflorals, for example, or bigger plants, for these I do use a slow release fertilizer in the pot. So I don't change the 4th dosage that I'm giving these plants, because of course they're in a larger pot at the time that they are a larger size. I'm not changing the dosage that I'm putting in the water, because the pot already has a bit of fertilizer in the pot as well. And with regard to the slow release fertilizer, again, we can get back to a video where I go in more depth about that, but that's for another time. And I'll leave you all with that. I hope this video helps someone. Leave your comments, leave your questions down in the comment section, and make sure you like and subscribe the video. Dislike if you didn't. But I really want to get some feedback here. I kind of been doing this for 2 years now, and I've lost a couple of plants, and I've been pretty successful with the majority of my plants, which is why I wanted to go on and just share how everything is going and exactly what I do here in my small apartment here in the States. For anyone else, for anyone else who fell down this rabbit hole. And lastly, I'm going to put my social media handles up there for anyone who wants to follow along. I post all my pictures and small stories and soon reels on my Instagram as well as in tandem with my Facebook. And with that, you all have a wonderful day. We'll see you next video.